Is that your station tonight?
It is. After
Okay.
Keith like did a bang up job up here, I was like, all right, I guess that's like the
No, I
new
was gonna
spot.
steal your chair.
Oh yeah, it's like. What are you guys looking at? Okay, I'm just checking the YouTube stream real quick, make sure that it is semi-functional. That's what we're going for. So we had a few layoffs. Two? Anyone else? Did you get laid off, Keith?
Okay. I'm hanging on somehow.
Where at? Just everywhere or?
There's been too many, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to share other people's business, but anyone, I guess.
I'll start the live stream.
Start the live stream. All right, what's your social security? Just gonna make sure the audio works on this. Okay.
It's just more than one place.
Yeah, there's been a lot of layoffs in tech over the last year plus.
So it's finally gets Spokane.
Oh, mine was a remote first U.S. based company, just all over the place in the healthcare industry.
Sorry, you're all hearing yourself talk. Just trying to tweak the audio. I didn't have so much time today to do all this before we got started, but
No worries.
it's all right.
It's a Japanese company that makes that as a feature, by the way. They, for like AV equipment for meetings, where you've got like a speaker and a microphone right in front of you,
Okay.
they pump feedback out with a half a microsecond delay. So that if somebody's over talking, you can, as the director, you can push the button and it will feed them back their own voice.
Oh.
You can't speak while hearing yourself.
I've heard that before, and I tried it, and it was difficult.
Damn.
I think we're going. I'm gonna try and keep an eye on we are going live chat, but I don't know that we really have anyone online, so that's all right. I like the people in person better because I can see your faces and talk to you, and people online are just like this enigma out there. Can you guys see slides? Cool. Show of hands. Who's used Django? I know you have. Who's used Django for more than like basics, like working with it?
Definitely no.
Okay. Okay. How long have you used it again?
I used it for like 6 months.
Okay.
Yeah, I was employed
Okay.
back in Seattle like 10 years ago, at least.
Okay.
It's a long time ago.
Well, feel free to chime in as I get stuff from you in the presentation. And you've used it for...
I've been using it pretty consistently for maybe the last 7-8 years-ish.
Okay.
Wow.
I've been using it consistently for like the last year, so feel free to correct me or chime in.
I've heard about it for now 35 seconds. Is that right?
You are also qualified to chime in. So we've got
I've heard of it.
two newcomers, so that's fun. It's been, I feel like the last few months there's been at least like one new person every time, so that's great. Welcome to the Spokane Pipeline User Group. My name is Joe. I'm the current organizer and sometimes host. Who all has hosted? You guys spoke at like the mini, like share what you're working on, right?
Yeah.
Okay. If anyone's interested in hosting about Django, so this is the getting started with Django. So maybe next month is the 8 years of experience with Django presentation. Just let me know. Would love to help give you guys whatever you need. Keith, how was it last month when you presented?
Super fun. Really glad when it was done because I had been stressing out about it for like 2 weeks. But yeah, I learned a lot. Forced me to kind of figure some stuff out. So.
Yeah, it was super interesting. We had a little bit more of a fancy setup. We had like two cameras going on here. I don't have any hardware, so it's just my computer. Cool. Moving on. So the Spokane Python user group is part of the Spokane Tech group. So there's actually two other user groups: the Spokane.net user group as well as the Spokane DevOps users group. The .NET user group doesn't really have anything scheduled in the near future, but the DevOps user group has been doing lunch and learns about once a month. I'll talk about the next one in a second. The building you're in, for those of you who don't know, is Intellitect, local software company, probably 50 to 60 people, mostly developers. We are always hiring, particularly right now, looking for senior software developers. So. For those of you looking for a career change or a job change, let's chat after. I can definitely get you in touch with someone who makes hiring decisions, which is not me. but I can I'd be like, hey, I met this guy, he's awesome. Let's see.
Who here is with Intelitech?
I think just me tonight. Sometimes there's more of us, but right now it's just me. And we've got 2 guys over there, but they're,
There's class going on tonight too, right?
there is the .NET class. Yeah, so there's actually, Intelitech teaches 2, soon to be 3 classes at Eastern as adjunct professors. I think it's usually over by like 4:30. So I don't know what's going on right now, but
If Mark is teaching, it's still 5.
yeah, yeah. I don't know if he's teaching this one, but
He did the last quarter,
yeah,
the straight .NET. This one's the
ASP.NET.
ASP.NET.
Yeah, I think it's Grant and Meg. But I'm not super involved in that, so I'm not involved at all. I just know about it. Cool. Also, Python user group. We try and meet on the 3rd Tuesday evening of every month. And we've been, for the last few months, doing code and coffees or coffee and codes on the first Monday morning from like 7 to whenever people have to get up and go to work. And that's been fun. DevOps user group, so I already talked about that, but the next lunch and learn will be DevOps versus GitHub revisited. I think that it's been spoken about before, but it was a while ago, and GitHub's project management stuff has changed a lot in the last few years, since whatever the last presentation was, so I think that's why it's being revisited. Follow us on the socials, us being Intelitech, also the Python user group itself has social media now, so you can find that by searching either Spokane Python or Python Spokane. One of those will work. Today's speaker, me. I don't know if I've actually, I make the slides, so I just put me. I think most of you have met me before, but my name's Joe Riddle. I've been a developer here at Intelitech for 3.5 years or so. I graduated from Eastern before that. I've been working in Django for like a little over a year, Python for like 2.5 years. We have what's called a snake infestation here at Intelitech because like a couple years ago it was basically just C#. Like almost everyone was doing C#, but now we've got like 6 Python developers, so it's kind of like slowly growing here a little bit. Cool. Let me swap. Those are just my intro slides. Let me swap over to my more fun slides. I don't know, I keep looking back, you guys are seeing the same thing I am. Anyone ever heard of MARP or MARPit? It's markdown to slides, because I hate PowerPoint, because I have no way to like source control it. Cool. So, getting started with Django. This is kind of funny because I feel like there's people here who know more about it, but I'm gonna do my best to talk about it. I was having.
You can always use me as your bar.
Yeah. Yes.
So I could.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I guess kind of going off that a little bit, if anyone has questions, feel free to interrupt. I think the goal is to have it more of like a conversation than me just talking at you for an hour and then we all go home. So, overview of the event. So we're gonna talk about Django. I already asked who all's heard of it. Who's familiar with like its batteries included philosophy, or like a little bit? So we were having a conversation before, I believe, and kind of comparing it to Flask, which is like probably, I think you said there was a developer survey recently, and it was like Django and Flask.
90-95% total market shares those two, with like Flask being like 1 or 2% higher than Django.
Right.
But a lot of the people that were answering the survey were not Python developers, they're Python users. So
interesting.
some of that's just like people that are using Python as a, I don't know, as a banker or something like that.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. So, and we were talking, and I was saying that in my mind, the biggest difference between Django and Flask is really its philosophy. Django sort of includes a lot of stuff out of the box, including like, I don't know, user authentication, authorization, forms, templates, URL management, let's see, like some RSS stuff, all sorts of stuff. Everything you would really need to build like, kind of beyond your basic web app. And then there's like, whereas Flask, I feel like doesn't really include anything out of the box. You basically have to install an extension for everything, which means that sometimes you're using a lot of different like third-party things that might not work super well together. I don't have a ton of Flask experience, so I'm probably putting my foot in my mouth a little bit there, but Django has like basically all you need to get your first like web project started out of the box, and there is also like a large community of like third-party packages that work well. Why it's popular and powerful, I mean, it's been around for, gosh, I don't know, 20 years or so. I mean, it's almost as old as Python, I think. I think it was like early 2000s when it was made. So it's kind of a juggernaut, like you said. It and Flask are kind of the two biggest web frameworks. I think followed shortly by Fast API, which I spoke about once a while ago. I kind of like Fast API for smaller little projects, and it's like really nice with type hints. Whereas Django, did you use type hints much on your Django project?
Everything once I started doing what's Python 3.6, 3.7 and beyond,
Yeah.
kind of trying to do it more.
Yeah.
Obviously it's not enforced, you can do whatever you want on there, but I would say not a Django thing, but a Python thing. I mean, it's, what are we at, like 3.11 now? It's time for type hints if you're not doing it.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's Django stubs, which is like a sort of a third-party adding type hints for things in Python that don't already have type hints. But it seems like most of Django things that don't have type hints. But I think Django at this point, almost everything that can be like have a type hint or a type annotation does. The part where it kind of falls down is like the really dynamic parts of Django. Even for example, and we'll get into this a little bit later. I'll try and get us into code as soon as I can because slides aren't as interesting. But like Django by default will add an ID field to all of your models, and like the type hinter, if you try and do like instance.id, will fall down and be like, oh, this doesn't exist. And that's where I think the Django stubs package will try and help you a little bit. So yeah, the goal for the evening, just that you'd be familiar enough to at least start kind of a basic Django project. So this is from the Django website. I was kind of listening to this a second ago. It takes care of user authentication, content admin, sitemaps, RSS feeds, and a bunch more stuff. This is where I will hop over to code. So our plan for the evening is just to kind of go through the sort of each little thing that Django gives you out of the box, like you're setting up your models, your views, your URLs, forms, some user authentication, and just do that with a simple example. One of the things that they actually use in the ASP.NET class that I like was just like a very basic blog project. So just like a post model, a tag model, and like a comment model, I think. So that's kind of what we're gonna do. Let me reload this because when I use WSL and Ubuntu or Docker, it takes up all my RAM, so I kill it and then I restart it. Let's actually just kill our whole source code. Such an image. Kill all the code. So there is a repo. So if you go to github.com/ I think it's python-spokane, you can see the code samples that we'll do today. Spokane/ let's see, getting started with Django. Also on spokanepython.com, we have getting started with Django. The slides are there if you want to follow along on your computer, and I'll upload the code sample at the end of the night. So that being said, I'll create a virtual environment real quick. How many of you use virtual environments in your Python projects? Everybody, all hands going up? Okay, cool. Then I don't need
Pip 2, right?
Pip 2, yep, for like TOO or TWO?
PIP isn't that
Yeah, Python.
Python? Is it an alternative to virtual environments?
Kind of. I'd say they more kind of like work hand in hand. Virtual environment like allows you to install stuff using pip, but not like pollute your global I guess workspace. Something that like I think npm does by default, like because when you do npm install, it installs it for your workspace, and you have to like manually do like dash global or dash dash global to like install it globally. That's something where I think Python does it kind of a little bit backwards. There's so many Python like package management tools and that kind of thing that I wasn't sure if pip2 like with it the number 2 was a thing I'd heard of. I don't know. Like there's poetry and pip tools and some other stuff. So I'll create a virtual environment real quick. And I'll activate it. Is that font size okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'll use pip to install Django. And it's going to include everything that we need for now. We're just going to use the SQLite database. I'd say most Django projects seem to use Postgres. Is that what you used?
It's usually based on a company standard. Like my last company standard was Postgres, and then the company before that, everything was MySQL.
Interesting.
So I think it's just whatever people standardize on. Of course, one of the best things about Django is that a database is abstracted, so you can use whatever you want and switch in between.
Yeah. Until you start getting into some of those like special like.
Postgres does have like extra things you can do, like that's simpler databases, including like MySQL can't. There's a whole extra package for Django specifically for Postgres that does things like full text search and other Postgres goodies.
Did you say that your project used like GIS stuff or no? Okay. Gotcha.
When you say Django is abstracted, do you mean that like the object relational layer where maps is capable of using any database? Does Django come with an object?
Yeah,
ORM?
I'm sure Joe will show the ORM, and I mean the point is he's going to set up right now with SQLite, and if you change the settings in the settings file, then you can use Postgres or anything else, or not anything else, but there's a number of databases.
So it's agnostic at the adapter level, but also the ORM is adaptable.
Is that something Ruby on Rails like has out of the box?
I mean more or less. Most frameworks stacks have object relational, or the ORMs are, they can choose your own off the shelf, sorts of things. I forget.
Yeah. Cool. So we've pip installed Django, and now that will install a command line tool, Django admin for us. I really just use this to create a project, and then it'll create a manage.py file for you that you'll, like 99% of the time, use that instead. I feel like there's a lot of different ways that people will lay out their Django projects. I don't actually love the way that it does it by default, but we'll just do that because it like creates a folder, and then it creates your default app inside of it. And I'll explain what an app is a little bit in a second. But it's kind of, I don't love it, so I'm just going to get it real quick. Which means after we all this stuff. And I think there's ways to not have to do this, but.
Yeah, one helpful hint is like when you start your project, start it named core, and then just rename the parent directory instead.
Oh, that would be quicker.
Yeah.
Instead of renaming every little file. Yeah, I think for a while, Django Python/Django developers didn't really like using the source folder naming convention, but seems like it's a little bit more common these days. I don't know if that's what the Django project itself actually uses, but I like to use it and it seems to work. So what I was saying is, now that we've ran this start project, this is sort of like, we'll lay out a very like skeleton of our project, but we don't actually really have much in it. We can look at these real quick. These files, other than settings and URLs, I don't think I've ever touched the ASCII or WSGI. These basically, the way I understand it is the Python has like a spec for, you can have like a, something like Flask or Django or Fast API, and then you have something that actually runs it, which is your web service gateway interface, is what WSGI stands for, I think. And that is something like G-Unicorn or Uvicorn are the two most common ones that I've seen. And those are like what actually runs it, and then your like web application sits on top of it. And so Django provides you these like interfaces out of the box for those ASCII and WSGI. Is that?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, when you're hosted in a real environment, like Django gives you a demo server, which I'm sure you'll show us in a minute. But if you like hosting it in the real, like Unicorn is probably the most popular, and there's a couple other web server packages that will actually interface into Django itself. And yeah, you're exactly right. That's what WSGI does. And for ASGI, usually it's for WebSockets, but same difference.
Yeah, and you can even like use like G-Unicorn with Uvicorn workers, I believe, to get like the WebSocket support, but still use G-Unicorn. But and then we've got the settings. This is basically like a project level settings for your whole project. Django gives you most everything you need to get started out of the box, and I would say that it leans more towards getting you up and running quick versus necessarily getting you up and running like securely. But there's really good documentation on like what you should basically change before you deploy into production. For example, I pushed this to GitHub and got an email like a minute later, like, "Hey, you pushed a secret key in your source code," because I hadn't changed it.
Who emailed you?
GitHub.
Oh, GitHub emailed you. Okay.
Yeah. I don't.
Guardian.
Yeah, Guardian. I think it's all public repos, and then maybe for private you have to like pay some money, but it'll basically just like scan your repo for anything it thinks is like a secret embedded in your source code and let you know like, hey, you should probably, particularly with like a public repo, like roll this credential.
Did it prevent you from posting, or did it just alert you afterwards?
It just alerts you after. It won't actually stop you from doing it, which in this case, this isn't actually running anywhere, and I was just getting started, so like, it's fine. I'll change it eventually, or when I actually, if I wanted to run it like on the web, but right now it's just on my machine. But I mean, Django's pretty good about telling you like, hey, security warning, keep this key out. And there's, as part of like the Django docs, basically a security checklist, like, okay, you've got your MVP for your project working, here's all the things you should go and do before you actually deploy it into, something that people can connect to.
Yeah, a log host is a whitelisting, so that's good that it's empty.
Yeah.
Nobody can access this.
I think when debug is true, I think it just ignores that. I don't remember exactly. But debug equals true is basically like keys to the kingdom in a way. Like if you ran in production, yeah, it's like if you get a yellow screen, like a 500 error basically, like, oh, something crashed, like it prints out like all sorts, like I think it like splats your settings into there, like
stack trace and stuff.
Yeah, so it's like, it's pretty, yeah, if you had that turned on, you'd probably be in a rough spot. So I mentioned apps, and I don't actually know if this default folder that it generates is considered an app. I think you can make it into it like an app if you want, but it doesn't have a lot of the things that like a traditional Django app would have, like any sort of like models or views. Usually I just like to keep it like really just what it generates, and then I'll create separate apps, which we'll do for like the blog models that we'll create. By default, it installs you a bunch of Django apps. The contrib is like, I think this is like a popular Python pattern where it's like not third party, but like someone came along and added it like later or something like that. Because there's like some stuff from Django that's just like Django dot whatever, but then there's some stuff that's part of like this contrib package. I don't actually know how they choose the difference between those, but a couple things that'll give us admin. So Django comes with this admin UI basically, which is actually I think one of the coolest things that it has. So with like, you basically create your model, and then with like one line of code, you register it to this admin site, and then you can do all like your basic CRUD stuff from there without having to go and like generate all these boilerplate UI just to create an instance of your model. So we'll do that. Gives you some auth out of the box, content types. We don't need to talk about that right now. Static files. So that's like your JavaScript, your CSS, that kind of stuff. It has some stuff out of the box for that. Gives you a whole bunch of middlewares by default. This is probably something else like ORM that's pretty similar, whether you're doing like ASP.NET, Ruby on Rails, whatever, where just stuff that gets run in between your custom code getting access to a request, and like the request actually being made. Like the Django API will like call this stuff for you. It's like cross-site request forgery, so Django has like, again, some good security stuff built out of the box to prevent like common security exploits, which I guess you would know more about than I. We're gonna use SQLite, just it's default and it's easiest because it'll just create that file for you. Yeah. And then I guess one other nice thing is that the basic project will give you a bunch of these like helpful doc strings for like if you're new to the project or just getting started with a new project, like kind of what to do to get going to the next step. So that is our quick tutorial of what it creates for overview. So models and the database. What are models? Why are they important? That feels like kind of a why are they important? I don't know. So I can do basically anything with my persist data. Who else is anyone not familiar with like an ORM or like SQL databases, at least like generally? Yeah, that's what I figured. It's pretty. You're not going to get super far with like a Django project if you can't persist data to a database. And Django's ORM is, I'd say, pretty powerful. And it gives you nice hooks to basically drop down into raw SQL if you really need to. In the year and some change, which really isn't that long, I don't think I've had to drop into raw SQL yet, but there are some sort of like in-between things where you're not necessarily like writing SQL in your Python code, but you're sort of going beyond like the basics of what the ORM gives you, like its basic like select and filtering and that kind of stuff.
Does it assume table structure beforehand, or create that?
So it creates the table structure just based on the definition of your models. So like whatever, in Django terminology, they call it like the fields in your models would map like typically one-to-one to the columns in your table. And it'll like auto-generate table names and relationships. It'll auto-generate, I think by default, only an index on your primary key, but there's pretty easy ways to tell it to like generate indexes on your other fields if you want it to.
That's kind of nice.
Yeah, there's actually this really cool tool that's paid, but you can get 5 free uses from it. So I've used like 4, and I'm hanging on to that last one because I don't. But it like, and I guess this isn't necessarily a Django tool, but we use Postgres, and you basically can do like a .explain, and it pukes out the like p-SQL explain statement, and you can put it into here, and it like tells you like, oh, you should add an index on this thing because it's super slow. Yeah, 5 times for free. So I read about it from I forget what his name is. He's like one of the core contributors to the Django team, and he wrote about it. There's other like free solutions, but they're more about like, oh, this is slow, not so much like here's what you should do to fix it. But
I got a question.
Yeah.
Do most people go with the kind of default Django ORM, or do they select something, something off the shelf?
yeah, good question. I've only worked on one Django project, so that is, sample size of one, and we are using the built-in ORM. But in like reading and stuff online about Django and like watching videos, have never seen someone replace the ORM with a different ORM. You can, and I think that Django is like built in such a way where you can swap out almost all of its major components, or its batteries, I guess. For example, the templating system, like writing the HTML and then like injecting Python into it. Django has one built in, but it also has good support for Jinja 2, which I think is the other big popular templating like language and or not language, but framework, whatever you want to call it in Python. I think that's what Flask projects typically use is Jinja 2. Has anyone seen a non-Django ORM on a Django project?
That survey that I was going through had SQL Alchemy as the most used ORM for Python in general.
That's the
Yeah,
one we use where I work at. They use it heavy, but we don't use Django with a lot of Flask stuff. So,
right.
yeah. I'm not on the development team, so I kind of like see it in passing or whatever, but yeah, I see the SQL Alchemy a lot.
Yeah, I don't know if people have, I'm sure there's a project out there, but I don't know that it's widely done to replace the Django ORM with SQL Alchemy. I've used SQL Alchemy, but not in a Django project.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I guess I don't know if there's features that it has that you would want to swap out Django's ORM for.
I haven't seen a comparison.
Yeah. There's another cool project that basically just is like a glue between two other really popular Django tools, and I think it's called SQL Model, which is like a horrible name.
Yeah.
It's by a guy named Sebastian Ramirez, I think, he created Fast API, and there's another guy named Samuel Colvin who created Pydantic, which is sort of like Python's data classes on steroids. Like
That sounds cool.
yeah, and it lets you. Sorry, I'm getting off track. So, Pydantic lets you basically define like models for like your API just using like type hints. It's actually pretty similar to Django's ORM in that way, and I think SQL Alchemy works similarly, but it basically brings those two together so you can define your SQL models just using type hints, but in a way that takes better advantage of Python's like modern type hints, whereas I think SQL Alchemy for a long time didn't really support type hints super well. But I know that there's like a SQL Alchemy 2.0 that came out not that long ago, so they might have overhauled that. Let's actually define some models real quick, and I'll add a blog app really quick. Oh, that's a train. It's like someone's got a ladder truck. So one of the other built-in commands to
Did you move the video just up?
oh yes, I'm sorry.
It's cool.
I was right there. You know what? We'll just go ahead and shrink it down.
Thank you.
Stick it up there. I don't know what the least used corner of the screen is. I always kind of just pick one, but
Top
I
right.
think the smaller is actually better, although now I can't see myself.
yeah. I don't actually. That's a good time to check in real quick. Okay. Cool. Yes. Thank you. So we're not going to use Django admin anymore. I really, again, just use that to do start project, but which creates this manage.py command. The manage.py, when you do that, sort of loads like the settings for your specific project. So it lets you do some commands that the generic start project can't do because it doesn't know about your specific project. So a Django app is really just a Python package with like some specific Django files, which are just Python modules or Python files. I think all you really need to actually create a Django app is this guy, this class that inherits from Django's app config, and then you just need to register it in your project level settings. Everything else you could actually like pick and choose what you want to use. Like you could have an app that doesn't have any views or doesn't have any models, doesn't have any migrations if you're not using models. It basically stubs out like the things that you're probably going to use for 90% of your Django apps, but that doesn't mean you have to use them. So we've created this blog app, and kind of the philosophy behind Django apps is sort of similar to like the Unix philosophy, where you like do one thing and kind of do it well. Or probably loosely paraphrasing there.
You did well.
Got the Linux crew in the back to keep me in check on anything Linux related. And so that's like, instead of basically just having like your project might do many different things, and instead of just putting all of that in one like folder, well-crafted Django apps are sort of like specific to a specific vertical within your project, I would say. All we have to do to use this app, which doesn't have anything in it yet, is just add it to our list of installed apps. And we just called it blog. So we'll save that. And I apologize, we're at 6:41 already and I haven't shown you much, so I'll try and pick it up a little bit here. And so let's create some models. So a basic Django model, or a Django model in general, so we'll create like a blog post and we'll just inherit from models.model. And so now we have, this would by itself, I don't know, I think without any fields, it would just create a table with one column with your ID, which isn't terribly interesting. So we can start defining some fields on our model. So what would like a blog post need to have?
Text, title, author, date.
Text, title, author. Okay, so let's go in that order. So text, or how about content? There's a whole list of fields, which are basically like each type of a field corresponds loosely to the type of the column in the database. There's two main text fields that are used a lot. There's char field, which is usually for like shorter form text, and that's required that you set a limit on that to like some number of characters. We'll assume that our blog post could have unlimited amount of content, so we'll use a text field, which is unbounded by default. So you said, let's see, you said text.
Title.
So we'll do models.char field. Do people pronounce that char? Char. I'm not trying to start a war here. So this max length is required. Tabs? Yeah. We'll just get into all of it. I don't actually have a good philosophy for what to choose here. I just kind of pick a value and what seems right, which is like not a great way. I usually try and go off some like power of 2-ish, like a 1024, a 2048. But what do people who've used Django before or other ORMs where you have to set some character limit? Like, what's your philosophy there?
Understand what the field is supposed to be. Like, if the title is going to be like a input text box, like, how big do you want that? Like, what type of logic might you be doing for like filtering and sorting and whatnot? You want to pull up records for title. I would say it's probably something short 32.
32.
Yeah, like when it comes to states, setting it to 2, it's a form of validation. Reject values that are longer. I'm surprised that there's not a default though.
You might be able to set one, like in your settings, but and there might be a setting for that. I have not used it before. So we'll do. Let's just do a value. That seems kind of short. We'll just do 512. Doesn't really matter. So let's see, content, title, what else?
Author and date.
So we'll do author, and we'll come back to this. So foreign key relationship here, staple of a SQL database. We'll come back to that.
Is that a spread operator?
That is called no, it's not. I wish it was. That'd be cool if Python had that. Which it kind of does, but I don't think it's called the spread operator. It's just the ellipsis, which I think you can actually import from. I don't actually know where it comes from. Oh, I guess it's just a built-in. So all this is I believe just a global like instance of this, which is basically equivalent to just doing pass. I think there's like one or two circumstances where they're a little bit different, but for the most part, you can just use them interchangeably where you would use pass. I just do it as sort of a reminder to myself to come back to what I'm looking at, but sometimes it makes the red squiggles go away. Let's see, what's the last one? Date. So let's do publish date or something. So here we have a choice. We can do date field or a date time field. Let's do a date time, and we can do auto now equals true. So there's, and I get them mixed up. There's auto. There's a couple options. Auto created and auto now. I believe auto created when the instance or like the row is inserted in the database for the first time, it sets it to that timestamp, but then doesn't update it on subsequent updates to your object. I think auto now, every time you update your any field on your model, it'll also update that field along with it without having to like manually go and do that.
That'd be annoying on a blog post though.
Yeah, so let's do.
Usually you want like the original date created to be preserved, right?
Sometimes you see those articles where it's like updated for 2023.
Yeah, so like if you're doing like a CNN news article, you probably want the last touch date to show up.
Sure.
But if you're doing like a Twitter feed and then you've got like a whole bunch of links off of that from other people replying and you change the original date.
Yeah, that would be good.
Or like a RSS feed, and then where you update some date and then it like moves things around in the RSS feed. That bugs me when that happens, and then things show up out of order. So okay, is there any? Are we missing it? It seems like a good place to start. I'll go somewhere. So the author. So we're probably going to want a foreign key to a user model. Django, like I said, offers like authentication, including like a user model out of the box, with a caveat. And the caveat is that Django basically, once you start your project and have like your first migration, and we'll talk about migrations, but basically once your project is like started for realsies, it's really hard to go and change the user model. And I don't mean like add a new field to your user model, but to actually like swap out the user model, like change the SQL table essentially.
Rebasing?
I only know rebasing in terms of Git, so I don't know.
I forget what it's called, but it's where you take the one model and then map it onto another model and then you have to do a whole bunch of transformations.
Not sure what the word for that is.
I might have the wrong word too.
Yeah. So we could do, let's see, so we could do from Django contrib auth models import. I think the default one's just called user. And this inherits from this abstract class that actually has most of the logic. So we could do that, and we actually probably wouldn't do it exactly like that. The problem with that is that if we look at Django's like out of the box user model, it has a username, first name, last name, email, a couple like sort of authorization flags. Probably all you would really need for getting started, but let's say like eventually you need your user model to have a new field. Maybe the age of your user, anything really. If you're using Django's out of the box user model, you can't really, that's not your model, so adding fields to that is kind of a no-go. And so I typically like to, even if I I don't plan on adding any new fields to just define a custom user model from the get-go so that I don't have to deal with swapping, trying to swap out the class reference for my user model. Actually, let's take a look at the docs real quick. So there's an auth user model, which we'll add in our settings. There should be a huge warning somewhere. Here we go. Or a sizable one. So yeah, you cannot change the auth user model during the lifetime of a project. There's ways to do it, I think. I don't know, I've never done it, but I take it that they added this warning because they meant it, so I don't know. Has anyone ever swapped out the auth user model after it was already created?
There's always ways to do it. I would say as a best practice, make your own model that's a one-to-one to the user model, so you have everything in that.
Oh,
and
interesting.
then you can just like add whatever you want. Age, affiliations, followers, that kind of thing.
So you would do a one-to-one instead of like inheriting from. Yeah. Interesting. How come?
Just to have logical separation of all the things that are specific to your app versus what's built in. Whereas like if you did inheritance, you essentially kind of have you'd have two tables with like a shared ID space, which is probably not what you want.
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like inheritance in Django is sort of tricky.
There's use cases for it, and there's use cases for definitely not doing that.
Yeah, because what it basically comes down to, you have two decisions when you inherit in Django. Is you can inherit and have one big table with all of your different child classes, but you might have a bunch of columns that are like null, or I don't even know if you'd have to do inheritance to do that. Or you have what you're kind of saying, like basically a one-to-one, where say you have like a vehicle table and then like a car table. Every time that you would want to reference the car table, you have to do like a join to that vehicle table, essentially, right? Maybe.
In that example, you probably just want to use the abstract class of car and then like manufacturers or something like that.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's do a one-to-one. I was just gonna create my own user model, but we could do a one-to-one. We can just use the out-of-the-box Django user. So we'll actually do that a little bit differently though. I think as another best practice is not to avoid using your user model directly, which is kind of funny that that's a best practice because once your project started, you can't actually really change it easily. But I believe that the best practice is typically to do like you import your settings and then do settings.auth user model, or get user model. From what I've read, these seem to be the best practices, but again, if you can't change your user model, or it's really, really difficult to after your project already started, then you could just import your user model directly. Either works. So we will, and I think it does this by default for you, but we'll just be explicit here. Let's add our auth user model. And so basically adding like there's just certain like keys in this settings.py file that mean something to Django. So to change that value, just reference the Django docs and go and add it here. Like, notice there's really, all this is at the end of the day is just a Python dictionary, but in the Django docs, like it means something. So if we're adding or changing our settings, we're really just adding global attributes to this module. We'll do django.contrib.auth. That's it. So then here we could do, instead of importing our user directly, code, we could do this. And so it's sort of, I'd say like more like loose coupling to your user model instead of like forcing those things to be tightly coupled, but both work. And then you notice that at this point we actually still have red squiggles, and that's because on delete is a required value to this foreign key, and all that really is if you delete your so we have a foreign key from our post to our user model. So if we delete the user model, like what do you want to do? Do you want to what do you want to do with your references to it? So we have a few options, and this isn't like a Django thing. This is, I think, more just a SQL thing. Cascade would be delete my user model, and so any post that has a reference to that user is going to get deleted. There's protect, which will basically prevent you from deleting the user in the first place. And then I think there's set null or default, which would just null it out. I think that requires you making the field nullable, which try not to do nullable fields unless I really have to. So I usually end up with either cascade or protect. There might be others, but I think those are the more common ones. So let's add our other classes real quick. So a post, a tag. We'll just give our tag a name. That's like I pressed an invalid key.
Oh, got it.
Just give this the same max length. We could add more stuff to that. Still enough now. And I think the other thing I said was a comment. So what would we need on the comment?
Text, author, date.
Content, author, and post date, again, just not a title.
Content, author, paste.
Unless you're gonna throw likes in there.
Emoji reaction.
We've created the next. Did you say publish date?
Twitter, yeah. Publish date, post date, comment date.
Do we need? Are we missing anything? Like,
Can you comment on a comment?
or what about commenting on a post?
Oh,
Or the post that's attached to it.
parent post or something.
So the foreign key?
Yeah. So let's do post here. Do on delete. We'll just assume if you delete the post, you delete all the comments. There's actually another best practice, I would argue, that we're not really doing right here, which is this is it reverse name? That's what it's called. Or sorry, related name. So Django does something really pretty slick for you, which is when you add a foreign key. So comment. Let's look at comment. So when I add a foreign key to post from comment, I can actually also access all my comments from the post model. It creates a query set reference, which is basically just like a query set is like accessing a collection of rows of that model type. But by default, it gives it kind of a funky name. Like we actually won't add it there because the auth user is not our model, so we could. Related name. So by default, it's something like comment set. I think it's like it takes the model name, removes any, and just like smashes the model name into one word, and then appends set, which is kind of gross. I prefer just to do like something that's a little bit more like semantic. You could actually do the same related name for multiple foreign keys because these are referencing different objects. If they were referencing the same object, then you would have to do different ones. I think that we can actually do this as well, even though it's not like our object posts. And then one other thing that we, I guess, might want to add to our post is tags. And here we can do a many-to-many relationship. So like one post could have like many tags, and one of those tags might be on many posts. So it wouldn't necessarily make sense to do a foreign key relationship here. And we will do to tag. you could either do that and do blog.tag, basically the app name and the name of the model. So you can do strings and Django will resolve them if you've had a circular dependency or something, or even just like, hey, this model is defined below this other model. In this case, I can actually just move that up above because tag isn't dependent on anything. But you can do like sort of lazy evaluation of your model names. And you can actually do lazy evaluation of a lot of stuff in Django. This would be posts. So, any comments? Anything anyone thinks we're missing?
There's one comment on related names. Did you say you like see that as a best practice kind of thing, or is it just you don't like the default names?
I don't like the default name because it's clunky. That's more of like the team I'm on a best practice is to override them. I don't know that that's
I think in
global,
most cases, I mean, with a number of users experience, and it will say that renaming related names when you don't have to can come back to bite you in the future when you're doing things like APIs and if you have any like nested relations and things like that. Usually I would only change the related name if for whatever reason in the model I have two references to the same foreign key.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that might be something our team is doing.
I mean, it could just be personal preference as well, but just.
So let's remove this one, and then when we get to actually referencing our related stuff, we can kind of see both ways. Anything else? I think we're good. We could add some doc strings if we were good developers, which we are, but we're not going to. So now we will do, Django has has multiple migration related commands, but there's really two that are used pretty often. In my experience, make migrations will basically detect, it basically does a diff between the state of your, of your database and, your database schema and the definition of your models. So right now, we don't. I think I renamed something to source and I should pick a core. Yes. Okay. So just source is a sort of our top level folder. You don't really hardly ever use this name. I don't use that name a ton in the stuff I do. But the core is actually like that. Would you call this app?
No, it's definitely not an app. It's your project level directory. You can put other Django things in there, basically everything except the models. Like if you had shared views, if you had abstract models, you can put them in there, but you have no reference to them because all models are referenced through an app. But no, it's your project level settings or project level folder thing. So
I guess you could technically have it as an app, and then you sort of have like I don't know if it's gonna happen. I've never done that.
It's not gonna like it.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. I haven't done that before. So let's run this again. So we'll run make migrations. Let's run help real quick and just look at some of this stuff. String model references must be in the name of app label.name. Oh, what did I?
You forgot dot model.
Oh, but so it says app label dot model name. Let's try that because it's not necessarily like a lookup app. Is it on here? I'm surprised that it. So to actually know the answer there, we could Django auth contra auth. So we could go look at that and look at its apps and see what its app name is, which is Django contra.auth. So it's really weird that I would expect that it would be this dot.
It's probably using the apps function like somewhere in one of the contribs or coughs, there's a thing we can look up a model based on name, like a string value, and that's like the combination of the app name and string name. So I'm assuming that's what it's using for that. I guess I'm one of those non-best practices.
We can do that too. There's a lot of ways to do some of these things. Okay, that's what was it. So we're gonna look at migrations real quick. There's a bunch of stuff there. You can dry run, which it won't actually create the migration, it'll just show you. You could merge migrations. So say you and your buddy are both working separately and making migrations in the same project. You could say you both create like a leaf migration or like the most recent migration that has like they're numbered. So maybe you have migration 10, both of you created. And instead of like deleting one of them and recreating it on top of the other, you just want to merge them together. You can do that. Some other stuff. We just want to do make migrations, and you can pass it optionally an app name. We will do our blog app name, and we'll create migrations for us. If we take a look at that real quick, you can write migrations yourself, or even data migrations, where if you need to do something that's sort of outside the scope of just changing like the structure or your schema, maybe you need to like go, I don't know, all of your users were living in Idaho and now they're in Washington, and you need to go update a time zone, or I don't know, that's probably, if you have to do that, something else went wrong way earlier in the project, but this is just hypothetically, I don't know. So you see it basically just creates like this, it looks basically the same as what we defined in our models.py. But this is sort of a snapshot at the point in time. So if we were to add another field later, we would only see that new field. I don't really look at these that much when they're just the ones that it creates for me. I really only look at them closely when it's the ones I'm creating myself. I think, maybe a while ago, Django's migration stuff was kind of flaky in some cases. Since I've started using it, I've never had any issues, but I worked with a guy who had used it a while ago, and he said he didn't really like it at the time when he was using it because it was sort of flaky. But I think that was like,
I've never seen any flakiness that wasn't human, like induced error.
Yeah, that might have been what it was. But
I once inherited a project with hundreds of migrations, and the outcome of rerunning it was just really horrible.
yeah,
I have to dissect, but that was a long time ago.
especially when you're running tests, migrations can become a pain. So PyTest has there's like Django PyTest package, which gives you like some nice integration between PyTest and Django, and it has a reuse DB flag, which the built-in Django test stuff probably has something like that as well. So if you're just like say running the same test over and over, or like you're just iterating on the same test, you can keep running it and you don't necessarily need to go through all of your migrations. But like maybe in your CI/CD pipeline, you are probably not going to be using that, and it might take a little while to like go through all of your migrations if you have like hundreds and hundreds of them. There is an ability to squash migrations, though I think it gets kind of hairy when you start having apps depending on other apps, and like if your code base is kind of messy, where like apps are all like pointing to each other, it can become pretty darn difficult to sort of untangle that to like squash the migrations down. I don't really have a lot of experience with squashing migrations, but I know it's a thing. That'll be in the intermediate to advanced one next month.
It's fine. Squashing works great.
Okay, there you go. I mean, we can come back to that because I'd actually.
Warnings, right? Is that like suppressing warnings?
I've done some interesting migration things. Usually it's when people want to change it. It's like, oh yeah, well, we're not using foreign keys anymore. Now we're using char, and you have to like redo data, and it's a more advanced topic. But yeah, it's just code. It's just data. You can do whatever you want.
This might be kind of a newbie question, but with this concept of migration, like, is it creating models that has to do with like the database like structure? What's like for a newbie, that what's migration mean in this context?
Yeah, so that's a good question actually, and I kind of glossed over that. I apologize. So Django has an ORM, which object relation or relationship mapper. So we can programmatically like define a representation of our SQL tables. Like if we look at our models, we can do that. But if you do that, that doesn't necessarily sort of solve the whole, that doesn't, you still have like one arm in SQL at that point, as opposed to both out of SQL, because you still need a way of like making those changes to your code schema happen in your SQL database.
Okay.
And so what the migration does is basically, I guess sort of two steps at least. One is, like I mentioned, like that diff of, oh, you added this new field to your model in Python, and I see that column doesn't exist in your SQL table.
Okay.
So those two things don't line up. So if you start trying to reference in your code that field, it's not actually backed by a column in your database, so you're going to kind of blow up at that point. So the make migration step is basically creating like a list of steps defined in Python. That's like the changes that need to happen to your database at that point in time.
Okay.
And then the second step is actually like doing the migration. And so that's where we were kind of talking about earlier, like you can have like your database is plug and play to a large extent in Django. So there's going to be like, I don't know what you call it, drivers for your, driver's not the word I'm looking for, but like,
to some extent.
yeah, like different drivers for different, adapters for different databases.
Okay.
So when you run the migrate command, it's gonna basically, and it's sort of an internal parching of it. I'm not
Sure.
I
think I get it at this point. Yeah.
Okay.
It's kind of like you kind of define these models, but then it has to go through the work of telling the database what that means and how that's going to translate. So it's kind of like building that relationship and putting that, mapping that out to the database kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Yeah. Good description.
Here's what's gonna break.
It's also kind of checked when deploying to server locally or production. It checks to see that the migrations have actually been migrated as a way to, like, don't run the program unless there's a database that is going to.
So going from environment to environment. Okay. That makes sense.
I was reading about doing like blue-green deployments in Django, and I guess this isn't even a Django specific thing, but like how do you, like if you have two instances of your Django app running and you're making like schema changes under the hood, like because in a blue-green deployment you would like all your traffic's going to, I don't know which color it is, blue, we'll say, and then like you spin up your green and then you start to reroute a little bit of traffic to it, and then if it starts to fail, you like roll back to your blue environment.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're making like a schema change, they're both your blue and green are going to be using the same database under the hood, like, most of the time, I would think. So I think there's ways you can basically do migrations where you can sort of like two-step it, where you would be able to still do that blue-green deployment without like having a bunch of traffic start breaking because you just dropped a field completely out that your new code's like referencing or something like that. That's just something I was reading about recently. But
Interesting.
Or you just don't do blue-green. Push it.
It's an interesting problem.
Yeah, I think what it really comes down to is you just have to do multiple migrations where you might just do it in one if you weren't doing that. Basically, you would like maybe deprecate a field and like just stop using it in your code as part of your first deployment, and then in another deployment, once neither blue or green is referencing that field, then you could remove it. But you can't do it in just one step without having like something break when you're trying to have both of those environments running concurrently. That's not something to do on my project, but it'd be cool too.
That'd be in the DevOps module.
Yeah. Maybe the next DevOps. We can talk about that. Okay, let's keep it rolling because I haven't really shown you that much at this point. So we'll run migrate. We'll just run it on block. So this will actually make the changes to our database. And I don't know. So there's no. Oh, that's there. So we'll just kill this. So I'll run this migrate. which will actually, for SQLite, it'll just go and create the file for you because that's really all SQLite database is just a file, at least in my experience. And this has like the tables and stuff in it. We actually only migrated our single app. You can see this blog initial migration, and we had a dependency on the auth app because we're using that built-in auth user as well as this content types. But there's some other apps that our blog app doesn't have a dependency on that we'll want to run their migrations to. So these are just provided by Django, part of the Django apps that we have installed. So at this point, I think we might be able to look at the admin screen. We might need to see instead. So we have this run server command, which is basically like a local like debug server, but not something you would typically use in production. That opened up somewhere. Yeah, so this is what Django gives you out of the box if you don't actually do anything, and it kind of nicely tells you why you're seeing this, because we have debug is true and we haven't defined any URLs. I think we can access admin. We don't have login for it. So that's where we have another nice little Django management command. So if we do Python manage, we cd into our folder, Python manage, and there's this create super user, which basically creates like this all-powerful user who can do everything. I can explain that a little bit in a sec, but for now I'll just create a user with a super secure password. It'll tell you your password sucks, and I'll say I know what I'm doing, and then all my data will get stolen. So now I think it just used my default Linux username. This is Windows, but I'm using WSL. Use my super cool password. So this is actually. Is anyone opposed to dark mode? Is that readable on the screen? Yeah, it's okay. My eyes are being blinded. So you can see that we have these. This is the Django admin. Like I said, a super nice little UI where you can do your CRUD operations. So I can add a new user if I wanted to. I could edit my existing user. So I'm a super user, which what this means is it says I can do anything if you're using like permissions or like authorization in your application using the built-in Django permissions. If you're a super user, you basically just like plow chuck right through it all and ignore any sort of permission checks. Staff, yeah, means you can log into the admin site, and then active is, so this is just like stuff that the Django user assumes you would want, and it's pretty solid. You can also obviously kind of add your own permissions or do more advanced like role-based, well, it gives you groups also, which you could use for like role-based permissions, but if you have a really sort of maybe enterprisey app or more than just like you might need some custom permission stuff, but what it gives you out of the box is pretty solid in my opinion.
They provide you with the default changelog?
Sort of. So from the admin, so let's make a change to my user. So my first name is Joe, and if I save that, so if I do this in the admin, is that still readable if I zoom out? I can see that I did that in the admin, so I do have some change tracking. If I was to go and edit this user really anywhere outside of the admin, you're not going to have any change tracking out of the box, to my knowledge. So it's really just for tracking like activities done here.
That's still nice.
It is. Yeah, but if you wanted like kind of audit logging for like users doing stuff in your application, you probably would do something different, I think. And you see we don't actually have any of our models in there. So if one of these modules that it got created by default when we did start app is admin.py. So this is where you would register your models, or there's also a Python decorator, so you can do it in your models.py file. I typically do it this way, but I think both work. So all we need is this one line right here to add our models to show up in there. You'll also notice that we have hot reloading out of the box. So if I save a Python file, my server restarts, which is it's nice. So if I refresh this, so hot loading, reloading, and then it restarts the server, not necessarily like React hot loading where it like refreshes like the page content for you. So we can create a blog post. Let's do today, now, hello world. Supports emojis.
Flask doesn't do that for sure.
Really? Let's say hello world. I'm the author. We don't have any tags yet, so we could save this. And so this is something that I run into when I'm not thinking. It's basically saying that it's required, and the reason it's required this many-to-many field is because we didn't add blank equals true. So there's sort of two things. That's a horrible sentence. There's two things. There's this blank and this null argument that you can pass to your model field. Null equals true, just means that it can be a null value in the column. Blank equals true is more related to like form stuff. Where it can't actually be null in the column, but it will still be required, like for example, in the admin screen, or if you create a Django form, which is like another built-in thing to Django to like help you do like HTML forms pretty quickly. If you don't do blank equals true, then it's going to require those in your form validation. That's sort of, there might be some other differences, but that's the biggest ones. So now so theoretically, because we're just using SQLite and we don't actually have like a prod environment, I could just nuke the SQLite and like recreate the migrations and just have one migration, or I'll just create another migration. And I can actually try and squash the migrations. I really haven't squashed migrations, but so we'll make a new migration because we changed. We didn't add or remove a field, which if we did do that, we'd have to create a new migration. But even just changing, I think most of the values that you can pass to these fields would result in a new migration. Yeah. So if we go look at that, we'll see that it's saying we're altering our field, and this is the new version of the field. So we'll just migrate that.
It's because the database layer has invariance of, like the database, it actually knows that field can't be null. It's a setting. So
yeah. So yeah, it still can't be null, but it can be blank now, which I don't actually know how it enforces that at the database level, because it's sort of hard to enforce because it's a many-to-many field. So like, how would you enforce a presence of a row creating a relationship between like two different tables? I don't actually know how you would do that.
I think it varies based upon the database, but these attributes, these properties of the model translate to, they translate based on the database to various constraints that are imposed when the schema, when it's being created.
Gotcha.
And so,
Interesting.
yeah, so if somebody else, if another application was attempting to use that, and it's anyways.
Interesting. Yeah. We could also try and squash our migrations. I've really not used this before, so I don't know exactly how it works. So, okay, so this is saying I told it the ID essentially of my most recent migration. If I say yes, you should commit this migration but leave the old one in place. The new migration will be used for new installs. once you are sure all instances of the code base have applied to migration, you squash it and delete them. So I'm not actually sure how it works when you create a squash migration on top of migrations that have already ran.
Well, if you look in your migrations file, you'll see.
Yeah. I think there's probably like a skip. That's at the top of the file. Like it's red when the migrate.
So is that this replaces? So if you have like a greenfield database or like a new database, it sees this and it's like, oh, I can run this one migration in lieu of both of these.
Yeah, if you go to the previous migrations, I suspect perhaps they're tagged as well.
With like skippable, you're saying?
Yeah. Maybe at the top they changed. No.
Yeah, just nuke your SQLite and run your migrating in, and you'll see them once it gets executed.
So, just before I do that, so if I run this migration, like everything's still gonna be fine, right? Okay, I'll just say I can't run a migration. So if I and then migrate, it just ran the squash migration. Interesting. So that's this replaces bit.
Yeah, but basically that just combines everything that was up from. I mean, you never squashed, only have two, and just to be clear, there's nothing wrong with having like a lot of migrations. I think someone said earlier maybe they can take a while, but I mean, programmatically and operationally, there's nothing wrong with having like 100 or even more migrations. If you wanted to manage code or just fix things or start from like a cleaner spice, then you can definitely squash. But yeah, I would never worry about squashing like 2 into 1 or anything at that level.
Yeah, that makes sense. So our user is gone now because we killed him. That's okay. I don't think it's
Do you ever name the migrations semantically, or are they all just generated?
So the generated name will give it a semantic-ish name if it's like, for example, I think that this alter post tags is semantic-ish, but this first one is doing a bunch of things. And if I like created one that was touching multiple models for some reason, it would just give it like kind of a generic name that doesn't really mean anything semantically. There's a guy named, I think it's Adam Johnson is who I was trying to think about earlier. So he is, what is he? Member of the Django technical board. I don't know, Django something. Writes a lot of stuff about Django as well that I like to read because, and he wrote about what you're talking about recently. I guess if anything, great blog for Django stuff.
So when you squash them, can you remove 0, 1, and 0, 2?
Yeah.
Was that warning saying wait until all projects? Because it said something about it was like if you have any projects that are using these existing migrations, then don't delete the migrations.
I don't know what the
something about Git.
Yeah, I think it's more just like a hygiene type thing, right? You don't want to. Yeah, I mean, probably don't delete your migrations until you've gone through like your testing and you make sure, because once you do that, you also lose the ability to revert.
Just roll forward.
Forward.
One way.
Yeah.
What are we?
Yeah, but in case it wasn't clear, I'm assuming you haven't changed data, you can't actually roll back migrations and like restore your database to like a previous version, which you can do once they've been squashed.
Yeah. So the migrations that Django makes for you out of the box are most, if not all, reversible. So you could you can run migrate, and yeah, it'll migrate forward by default if you don't tell it. But you could also give it a like 001, like an ID for a migration in an app, and it can go backwards too. If you write like custom migrations, you have to be explicit about yeah, and it has like a no-op where like say you're doing some sort of data migration where going backwards doesn't really make sense. You can just tell it like
you can't roll back.
You can tell like you can go back, but it just doesn't do anything because it wouldn't like if you're changing data that you can't unchange, then I apologize. I am well over. We're at an hour and a half, and I have not shown that much cool stuff.
It's alright. Who's the asking stupid question?
No, questions are not going to
It's really interactive.
To be honest, when I saw that it was only an hour, I was like, what are we gonna accomplish in an hour?
And if anyone needs to leave, feel free. Well, 8 at the latest. We'll call it good. And I'll maybe just try and. I probably won't get through all the stuff I wanted to, but.
You did call this getting started, so technically you filled your mission as soon as you started typing, so.
Fair. That's when I'm. It's like how to go tomorrow. I'll be like, I got started. So now we can create that. Let's just add a tag. Whatever that is.
Affidavit rate, that's great.
Affidavit. That's so we'll save that. We add a comment while we're at it, just to flesh everything out. Wow, this is some great Django content. Cool. Okay, so we got one of everything. We're not doing anything with them other than showing them, other than they exist in our database. I think we hit those bullet points. Any questions on models or migrations before I maybe try and hit like 1, maybe 2 more slides? Okay, cool. So, views and templates. So in like who's familiar with like MVC, model view controller? So we covered the model part. I read about this before because I came to Django from an ASP.NET project. Well, it was the last web project I had done was ASP.NET. I've done a Python project before, but it wasn't web-based. And I understood how like MVC worked in ASP.NET, but in Django I was kind of confused. And this is what I remember. This is what I came away with. Was that Django, so in a model view control, your models is like your schema essentially. Your view is like the kind of front end, like what you're showing users and like logic related to that. And then the controller sort of like handles the interaction between the two. It's kind of my understanding at a high level. And I was like, okay, Django has views, we've got models, but like what's the controller? And in my mind, the controller was like your views and your templates were the view, which is kind of confusing. But from what I read about Django, Django actually would consider itself the controller, and your views and templates are views in an MVC paradigm, and your models are your models. But the controller stuff is actually, to a large extent, Django itself. So that's what I read. I could be wrong, but I was confused when I first started learning Django about how exactly it fit that paradigm. But that being said, let's define a basic view. So, now that I've muddied the waters a little bit, a view basically is just I got an HTTP request and I'm giving you an HTTP response. So that's all it really is. So we'll just name this list hosts, which will take a request. If we want to get really cool, we'll add type hints. But you certainly don't need them because it's Python and type hints are always optional. We'll return a response. It has helpfully given us this function called render, which is basically sort of combines a few different things. So we'll call it and then we can kind of maybe walk back what it's actually doing. So we'll call render, we'll pass it our request, we'll pass it a template name, which we'll call list posts.html, which we haven't defined, and then we'll give it this empty dictionary, which will actually is context. So right now we haven't actually wired this view up to anything, so we have no way to navigate to it. So that's something else we'll need to do. So this is something I don't really understand about Django. It creates all these modules for you, but it doesn't create a urls.py module, which is like sort of one of the fundamental modules of a Python app or a Django app. I don't know. So we'll actually just copy and paste this for now, and then we'll just change it out. So we don't need the admin because you only have to register the admin URLs once. Django helpfully provides you like sort of a getting started for adding your first view. So we just created what's called the function-based view, and the reason we know it's a function-based view is because it's not inside of a class. It's just a global function essentially. So we will import our views. So we'll do from blog our app name, import views, and then there's this special URL patterns thing which Django knows about, and we will do path, and we'll just do an empty string basically indicating that this URL or this view that we're trying to navigate to is just at like the root path. So we'll do views.list posts, and then we can do an optional name of list posts, which allows you to do some reverse lookuping in reverse. That's not a word. We'll also add this app name thing, which basically like namespaces our URL names for our reverse looking up. That's it. So we'll just name this blog. And I have the black formatter installed, and on save it auto formats, in case you're wondering why it's moving around. So now we've defined this URLs module, which is great. It exists in our blog app, but it doesn't actually exist in like our project settings, which is where it actually needs to be added. And so typically in like a Django project, you would have your root URLs, and then in there you would add like your app specific URLs, but you can sort of have like this hierarchy where you don't need to have a flat list of every URL in your entire project in one file. I think most web frameworks probably work that way. So we'll just do include, which is going to include the URLs that we defined elsewhere. We'll just put the blog stuff at the root because it's all we have right now. And I think that we can just lazy look up our blog.urls module. Let's restart this. So at this point, we should be good to actually navigate to our site and see that our template doesn't exist. So we're actually kind of covering a few of these in one, not at a deep level by any means, but again, it's getting started. So I'll show you templates and just templating context, and then we can call it a night. If anyone wants to hang out for a little bit, they can. But that's the last thing I'll do for tonight. We can certainly have, I think Django's big enough that it's probably something that could be covered in more than one night. There's conferences around it. There's dozens of us. More than dozens. So that error is coming from here, and so this is actually just a brief aside, this yellow screen is because debug is true, is turned on. If I was to turn off debug mode, I would just get a super helpful 500. Yeah. Oh, you must set allowed hosts if debug is false. Well, just take my word for it.
0.0.0.0.
Okay, killed my run server. Cool.
There you go.
Add request.
You bounced it, my friend. You bounced it.
Well, obviously that, because that's okay, back here.
So can't find the URL. Is that what's happening?
So I think it's because I'm using the local IP 127. If I was to do 0.0,
Oh, that's one thing I was missing out. So I thought it was gonna be / list posts, but you mapped the list posts just to like the root /
Yeah.
directory. Okay,
Yep.
okay.
Yeah, and then because 0.0.0 doesn't exactly match the the IP address I'm doing or host name, if I was using a host name, I don't think that it's
Disallow.
so it doesn't want the port. That's why it just wants the host name, which makes sense. Okay. So we're back to our template, and so this is what I was going to show. It gives you this really nice traceback, and you can even like inspect local variables. So if you're getting like template errors or various other errors, you get quite a bit of information when debug true is on. I don't know if it. Okay, so it does hide your secret key. That's nice at least, but there's still some stuff in here that you probably don't want to share with the world when they get a 500 error.
Is your server? Oh yeah, it's debugging as well.
So let's just get a template. So we'll create a templates folder in our app, and then we'll actually, and this kind of confused me when I first started, we'll create a folder with the app name inside the folder named templates. Basically, it's the way the Django template file like searching happens is it's like namespaced by the folder within the templates folder. It's kind of my understanding. So if you just put templates without this blog folder inside of it, then if I had, say I had list posts.html in some other app for some reason, maybe I have both a blog and my company also sells fencing equipment, so I have 2 different types of list posts. It would just grab the first one that it finds, or probably a more common example if you had like index.html in multiple of your apps. If you don't like namespace them with that folder, it would just grab, I don't know what order it would go in, but it would probably grab the one you don't want, just whatever the first one it sees defined is. So that's essentially why we're adding this extra layer. And then we'll do list post.html, I think. So we have blog list post.html. Maybe I misspelled something or forgot something. Oh, there we go. Cool. Thanks for coming. I'll just show you how you can use the context. So we've got a blank screen. I'll just kind of stub out some real basic HTML. Posts, hello. Cool. This is not riveting, but and this is where we can use Django's built-in templating engine. I don't know if it has a name beyond Django templating engine or whatever. There's also Jinja 2, which you can swap out, and that's actually, to my knowledge, one of the more common pieces of Django that people might swap out, especially if they're a lot more familiar with Jinja 2. I haven't done that, but you got this nice little curly brace syntax, which is fairly limited. You can't write any arbitrary Python in here. Like, for example, you can't call a function with multiple arguments sort of out of the box. You have to, there's what's called template filters and template tags, but we'll just do some real basic stuff. But we can't do a for loop. So this works very similarly to like HTML tags, except the syntax is different. So we'll do an unordered list, and then for each of our posts, we'll do a list item, and we'll just do the post. I could do post.content or something. If I don't do that, it's just going to use the dunder_stir method, which none of these actually have, so it won't be very pretty to begin with. This will either blow up or just not show anything. Oh, so I forgot that guy. So it's blank, and that's because posts isn't actually.
Qualify. It's not brought in a scope, which is where that's typically in the controller that you would define posts.
Yeah, exactly.
So is that in the URLs?
So we would actually do it here, and that's what this context thing is. So from here, we would import our models. And let's say our blogs are models.blog. So when you have a Django model, you have this .objects. Oh, sorry, not blog, post. And this is basically like your way to interact with the database, or like your main way to query the database or interact with it. So here we could do, you have a whole bunch of stuff that loosely correlates to like SQL, select, and where, that kind of thing. Like get, filter. We'll just do all, which will just give us what's called a query set of all of our, I'll just import it to the explicit. Typically, this is probably overkill in terms of typing, but just to show you that. So it's not like a list, it's a query set. And one of the fundamental differences between that and like just a normal Python list or some other Python collection object is the query set is lazily evaluated, sort of like a generator. So at this point in time, if I was to set a breakpoint like here, blogs there would be no database call made yet, because I haven't actually iterated over the query set. It won't, like if I never actually use blogs, if I just did this line and never actually used it in some, either by iterating it or by adding another function call at the end that's going to execute the query, for example, .count, like that would actually have to go and make a SQL call to give you back the integer. But if you're just doing like, say I do some filtering, blah, 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 I do some like excluding, blah, 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 like I can basically pass this thing around all day long and not actually execute it until I want to.
So it's not until a template iterates through the actual database.
Yeah, so in that for loop we define in our template. We could, if we wanted to, we could force it to execute by like wrapping it in a list. That would, well, now it's complaining because this isn't a query set anymore, it's a list. There's really no reason to do that in this case. So context is just like a dictionary object. I keep writing blogs instead of posts. So I'll read lists. So at this point, and actually VS Code, I'm just running it using the command line right now, but if I was using VS Code's debugger, you can actually set breakpoints on the Python parts of your template, and it'll trigger those, which is nice. And then obviously you can debug like the Python code itself. So now we have this lovely post object 1, which is like the default string representation. It's just the name and the ID. If we wanted to give some other default string representation, we could return, say, self.title.
There's not an explode, like a way to just have it, or to JSON or something, where it can just give you everything that it has.
Like just kind of plop out all the
Yeah.
fields.
Function like that.
We could do that, and I think that there's a built-in, is it Django template filters? I think there's a JSON one actually. Maybe not. I think there's something.
Run to the bathroom real fast.
Yeah. These don't look like what I want. I mean, typically, I don't know how useful that would be other than like sort of debugging.
Yeah, just
but,
debugging.
Yeah. There might be. It's not something I use.
What you did in the views too, that's what I would consider a controller. It's where you're essentially setting up the view.
Yeah, like in the other main framework that I'm familiar with, like ASP.NET, that's sort of like you would define a class that's like your post controller, and it would have methods that are sort of similar to this, but
Can you specify like RESTful actions in here? Like how they respond? Like how would you do like a put?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So like if you had a form and you want to do like a post or something.
Yeah.
So on your request object, you have a method. And so if, say I wanted to check if this was like a post,
I see.
you could do something like that. If you wanted to do like actual API like stuff like JSON and that kind of thing, you'd probably reach for a extremely popular library called Django REST Framework, which just sort of adds some more RESTful API capabilities. I think Django by itself is primarily for like HTML. There's another one called Django Ninja that's way less popular that I think uses that Pydantic library under the hood to do some more type hint stuff. But you'd probably Django REST Framework. I mean,
Django REST frameworks are going to be your best bet. In my humble opinion, of like having really powerful and extensible APIs, if that's what you're getting at. There's probably a million different ways to like make a REST API in Django, including if you've got a simple class-based views, there's like a JSON response. You can see up there in this import online forward, there's like HTTPS and HTTP response.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's in that library, but there's also like a JSON response. And you can literally just do like a JSON loads or the query set itself. I think there's like a to-dict option, and then you can just like send that JSON response to have, basically just operate there, and then you'll see like literally even in your browser that it's going to be like a JSON like object.
And that reminds me, I think that, where is it? Details. Details? Is it
the view itself, you can render out almost anything you want. You can render out like a CSV, you can render out like XML, you can render out like literally just text if you wanted to. There's, I mean, it's usually not the most popular use case, but you can do anything with that, and there's different renderers that do that. In fact, even if you just change like what and like the render, I don't know if it's render or one or the other, like if you return an HTTP response instead of the render, I think you can set like the context type to be like text or JSON or image or whatever is applicable for the type of thing that you're restarting back. There's like a million.
content type? Yeah, I guess by default it just assumes it's HTML. Okay, in 752, so I covered at a very kind of intro level models, use templates, URLs. We didn't get to forms, which is probably the other biggest piece of Django, just to allow you to do like a form to create a new post where you're not going through the admin or like the CLI, but probably the actual like meat and potatoes of your web app is forms and then displaying data. It's really all anything is a form or like a table of some sort. We sort of looked at the user authentication. We used it. We didn't go too in depth with it. There's some more depth than what we saw. We did see the admin interface, so I guess forms is really the main thing that we didn't get to. The forms work very similarly to the models, where you basically just define a list of fields on your form, and instead of using fields, you do like forms dot like char field, I think, and then you can override like the widgets by default. Like if you have a Boolean field, maybe you want like a checkbox, or maybe you want like a drop down where you say like yes or no, like that kind of stuff. But on the Python side, it's really fundamentally similar to the models as far as the way the code looks. And there's some helpers. There's probably a bunch of different sort of helper third-party packages for forms to make them look pretty. A really popular one is crispy forms, where you basically just add your Python form object to your context, and then in the HTML you just pipe it in one line to this thing like crispy it, and then it just makes like this pretty nice looking form. You don't have to like every form you make, you don't have to like kind of make it look pretty. You just use that. So yeah, I guess that's my recap. Jumping on next steps for learning Django. If you want to present, that would be great. We could go deeper.
What would people be interested in knowing? Obviously APIs, that's another big thing. Middleware, yeah.
Yeah, we didn't touch on that. I think of stuff. I'd be curious if you have experience. I have not found a pattern that I like for using Vue or really any front-end framework with Django in a way that feels like I'm taking advantage of what the front-end framework has to offer. Like a lot of the solutions I've seen to Vue, like integrated Vue with Django, it's like you have to do like single file components, which kind of a little bit more.
Are you trying to integrate, or are you having like two like traditional front end back end type system?
So like not I guess integrate, not like a clean separation where like all of the interaction to the backend is going through like an API, but sort of being able to like mix the views in with like normal Django stuff. That's something I've ran into.
We haven't really done a lot of Vue.js, but usually when someone wants to use a JavaScript-based framework, they completely separate. Like, the paradigm you see over and over again, it's like, Django plus DRF for like the backend to make really kick-ass APIs, and then have a full separate JavaScript front end. Of course, I've been on the HTMX bandwagon lately, so I'm kind of like down on JavaScript.
I would actually love to see that too.
HTMX.
Technically, it's a JavaScript library that aims to like get rid of JavaScript. But it's been embraced a lot by the Django community. Basically, so you can do a lot of like single page app type things where you get live updates of like just different components on a page. But it's
really cool.
Instead of if you've done any like front end, back end type stuff, usually you have some kind of like Ajax call. You build like a response thing in JSON. You pump that back. You get another response back in JSON. You parse out a thing, and then you insert into like a component somewhere or whatever. It's just like really clunky. HTMX, basically makes a call to, another, like just a simple view like you have there, and returns a block of HTML that you just directly import into a tag or a tagged element. Super simple, like, very powerful.
Do you have to define like kind of these one-off like Ajax-y type views, or does it just use the same view and it just swaps out the content that you want to?
You can use the same view if you want. So like, and I've only done a couple of things with it, but like literally, like say like you load in a table or something, you can do like a load in table on load, and if you do like a filter or something, call the same view to like generate like the rows that you want to put into that table, and put it right into like the same like your table named or your table tagged.
That sounds really cool. The bummer about like doing the clean split between the front and back end is you kind of lose one of the coolest tools of Django, which is like it's kind of the templating engine and like the server-side rendering side of things, and I don't know, I like using that. But yeah, I would. That would be super interesting for me personally. The HTMX is something that I've heard a lot about but never used.
Sounds really cool. Especially if you're not a JavaScript person.
I'm interested in the performance of that though. Like every time you're making new elements, it's the way the browser reflow the page and all of that.
Yeah, so I don't know if you follow like DjangoCon. I want to say the European one from like 2021. I think they literally did like some guy who like was running a company like, oh yeah, you have to have React because React is the thing that everyone does now, right?
Yeah, because it has a virtual DOM and diffs.
Yeah, but they literally just like rewrote their entire app and just like full stack instead of like front end, back end. And basically, what it had all the stats to like show it, and it's like, okay, well, I was able to have all of my developers work on the same damn thing instead of having separate back end, front ends. They're able to do it with like less headcount, less code, and then you had performance statistics, and it was slightly more performant with HTMX and not React.
Does it play well with like UI frameworks? I guess it's probably not opinionated about like your UI, right?
Shouldn't care that it's just a block of whatever. So like if you're using like Bootstrap or Tailwind or any of the other popular things, it's just you're going to be rendering some HTML with that in it.
That would be super interesting to hear about. Well, we're almost at 8. Recap, I kind of did that already. So if you guys are wanting to learn more, there's the official Django tutorial is pretty good. It covers by and large a lot of what we covered today. Mozilla or MDN also has their own tutorial that sort of touches on some things that the official one doesn't go into as much, I think. There's a really popular book called 2 Scoops of Django. Yeah, it's good. I think, so Django 4.2 just released like April 3rd, I think, and that's the new long-term support version. Not, from what I saw, not too much change from the last LTS version, 3.2. That this book only goes up to 3.2, last I checked anyways. And then we also, on the Spokane Python, there's this resources tab, which just sort of has kind of a hodgepodge of different things that are, and there's a Django section. So it's not super, like, this isn't like you should start first and go to the end. It's more of just like a collection of interesting things that people have found. We're at 8. I don't want to, no one has to leave or anything, but I know people have got lives outside of code stuff. Any questions as far as the presentation goes? And if not, I'll kind of shut the presentation off and people can hang out. Cool. Thanks, guys. Thanks for being here.